Hello, everybody. So this week, as you all know, we are going to be taking a break from new readings. The focus and the goal of this week, as I said before, is to really focus on your writing and sort of honoring the process of writing, to test out some of your ideas, to start drafting, outlining, etc. And in our case for our discussion forum this week, we're going to be actually workshopping your introductions and thesis statements. Okay, so this gives you an opportunity to develop what I think of as one of the most, if not the most important aspect of your essays, which is basically where you get to introduce to the reader the text that you're going to be discussing, any pertinent context, social, historical, linguistic context that is necessary for the reader to understand where these texts come from. The sort of structures and the environments in which they have been born out of. So that is another critical piece of your introductions. And then also, of course, introducing your authors, and most importantly, providing a specific argument that puts whichever text you're choosing into a specific conversation with one another and making an original claim, right? And by original, I mean a claim that is coming from your own ideas, coming from your own specific way that you are putting these texts into some kind of critical dialogue with one another based on whatever theme or prompt you've chosen. So some of you have already been posting your introductions. I will be giving you feedback as well, and you'll be providing some constructive feedback on each other's work. You're going to be responding to two of your fellow classmates' introductions and thesis statements, and I've given you some questions that you can use. You don't have to answer all of those questions, but I'm giving them to you as a kind of guide to help you develop thoughtful and generous responses to one another, right? The goal here is not to be hypercritical. It's not to be, certainly not to be mean. It's to be as thoughtful of a reader as you can be, and to provide really sort of tailored, specific feedback for your fellow classmates so that he or she can go back and say, okay, this wasn't clear, I need to tweak that, or, this was a good idea, I need to develop that a little bit more, and perhaps you have even some suggestions on how they can do that. So that's sort of the goal of this week's workshop, right? Ahead of your due dates for the midterm essay, which is this Friday, the 12th by 5 p.m. Okay. Under the module for this particular week, this writing week, you will see a couple of resources available to you. You will also see resources right at the top of the module link with MLA guides and formatting guides. If you have any questions about that, you could always ask me. And you will also see two sample midterm essays from students from past semesters. These essays are not perfect essays, so I don't want you to be, reading them with that presumption. But they are solid working examples of essays that are doing a number of things well. So I wanted to give you something specific and tangible to look at, to use as a sort of guide, and to help you evaluate your own work as you are drafting and working through your essays. I am going to go over, just since we are focusing right now on your introductions and thesis statements, I am going to just go over sort of what at least one of the samples is doing well in the intro and thesis, so that you're clear, right? First of all, they both actually introduce the text clearly by their titles. They include the authors. They also, in the case of Pu Sangling, they also note where that actual short story came from the larger collection, right? Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio. Make sure that you remember, when you are citing a short story like Lotus Fragrance, for example, that would be in quotes. If you are citing the formal title of a play like Bakai, that would be italicized. And if you are citing the collection that a text came from, For example, Lotus Fragrance comes from Pu Songling's Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio. Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio would be italicized, okay? These are just like technical formalities that can be confusing. So I just want to clarify that. So we have authors. We have clear introductions of the text. In both cases, we get a little bit of context for the works that they are choosing. In sample one, we get a little bit of brief context on Euripides, who is obviously from ancient Greece, versus Pu Songling from an ancient Chinese tradition. So there's obviously a brief mention, at least in the first example, of where these texts come from. In the second sample, you get a little bit more detail. The student actually draws from some of the introductory notes from the lectures. You can do that. I would have minimal quotes in your introductions. You can save that for your body paragraphs. You're very welcome to draw specifically from the lecture notes if they've been helpful. You're welcome to draw from the introductory materials that we've read in our anthology, for example. So you can and you should draw from these resources. I would just do so in terms of quoting, larger amounts of text in your introduction. I would do that sparingly. But you get some context in each sample of where these texts come from, okay? And then in the first sample, I'll just sort of read through the thesis. You say, this person says, due to the difference in the values of Greek and Chinese cultures, the stories diverge such that Lotus Fragrance focused on the threat female sexuality imposed to the family, while Bacchae focused more on the threat it imposed on society. Their similarities and differences ultimately suggested the need to repress female sexuality and implied the justification of female subjugation in both cultures. Here's what's working about that thesis. Here's what I like about that thesis. It is a clear attempt to find a relationship between these texts. It isn't just saying something more observational. You may have heard me use that term before, observational. It isn't just saying female sexuality is explored in both Songling's and Euripides' stories, and those differences can be compared and contrasted. It isn't saying something sort of basic that most people would support and claim as well. There isn't that same level of originality, and it doesn't really put the texts into a relationship with one another. It draws sort of one example of how they connect. Female sexuality is present in both, for example, and insinuates that they can be examined in some capacity, but doesn't actually tell the reader how. Doesn't tell the reader, well, here's what's at stake in this essay. Here is the claim that's being made, right? Think of your thesis as an anchor, right? It's what grounds your essay. It's what you return to as you're working through your body paragraphs, because those body paragraphs, in essence, are a way to help you explore and support why you are making the argument that you are making, okay? So I like this thesis because it showcases sort of the impacts. It showcases where they align in terms of how they explore female sexuality, but it doesn't just stay there. It actually says, because of the difference in values in the Greek and Chinese cultures, and that could be expanded on a little bit there, I think, the stories diverge such that Lotus Fragrance focused on the threat female sexuality imposed on the family, while Bacchae focused more on the threat it imposed on society. So here's where they sort of differ from one another. And then it goes one step beyond that. Their similarities and differences ultimately suggest the need to repress female sexuality and imply the justification of female subjugation in both cultures. So there's a claim that's being made. There's a real argument that's being made. I could see how this claim could potentially be argued from another perspective. Someone might take an alternate point of view and argue that claim from a different perspective. So there is something at stake here, right? I can kind of see how this essay is going to be laid out. I can see sort of what the anchor of this essay is. And you want to make sure when you're working through your own introduction and you're working through your own thesis statement that you too have a claim at stake and that it's something that is yours and it's something that someone else could argue from a different perspective. So use that kind of test to make sure that your thesis is sort of analytical in nature versus observational in nature, okay? So I just wanted to sort of talk through that briefly. I know some of you are English majors, and for you, you're pros at this, I'm sure. But for those of you, who are taking this course for fun as a kind of like elective in your swan song of college, I wanted to make sure that you were very clear on what the function and job of an introduction is, and more specifically, what it is in the context of a comparative literature course, right? Where we aren't just reading texts from a specific tradition, where we are reading texts from different cultures, from different traditions, from different historical moments. So we have that extra job of thinking, okay, well, here's how this text is situated in this culture and at this time period and with these values, and here's how this text is situated in this culture with these values during this time period. How do I then bring them into conversation with one another? Where do they align? Where do they diverge? And why does that matter? What argument am I trying to make here? Okay. So I think that's it for now. If you have questions about your work that are not answered in my feedback to you during our forum, feel free to email me. I have office hours tomorrow from 10 to 11 a.m. So you can pop on if you want to chat and ask a question there or just run something by me. And otherwise, I'm excited to read your essays. I'm excited that we're almost at spring break. Hallelujah. Okay, so writing away. Good luck, and I will see you in our discussion forum. Bye.